David Armstrong is an Australian philosopher, or was, who published a book called The Materialist Theory of Mind. And he's not the first to advocate for the idea that the mental can be reduced to the physical. He's not the first by any means, of course. This is an idea that you find in the pre-Socratics, in the atomists, people like Epicurus. Hobbes in early modern philosophy is a materialist. But his materialist theory of mind book was a sort of particularly well worked out version of it in the context of the then modern science. This article, The Nature of Mind, is basically a nice introduction to the idea, placing it in the context of philosophy at the time, and it also contains his response to an objection, which, as we'll see, wasn't particularly convincing, and the objection gets restated by people like Nagel and Frank Jackson, another Australian, later on. So, looking at the article, first of all, he says, he explains why he defers to science as providing the correct picture of the universe. So, in other words, his book is called The Materialist Theory of Mind. Usually nowadays, instead of materialism, which is sort of the term that dates back to people like Hobbes in the early modern period, as somebody who argues that matter is the only stuff there is. So materialists are monists in the early modern tradition. You have Descartes, who is a dualist, who believes in matter, but he also believes in this separate substance called mind. Materialists say, you're right about the matter, you're wrong about the mind. So the only thing that exists is matter. Descartes believes in matter, but he thinks he can't explain things like thinking and so on, whereas materialists say it can. So their challenge, of course, is to explain explain features of the mind in material terms. Okay, physicalism is considered a better term nowadays, in that in the time of the early moderns, they thought literally the universe was made of little tiny balls that sort of bounced off each other. There was no concept of things like forces and charges and energy and that kind of thing. Whereas now physics, matter is, if anything, sort of an artifact, and the real nature of the universe is sort of forces and waves and that kind of stuff. So it's better to say physicalism. If you're a physicalist, then you believe that all there is to stuff that exists, to the universe, to the world, is what physics talks about. There is no extra stuff that physics can't access, which is what a Cartesian mind would be. Descartes believed that science, the modern science, the science that was just taking off when Descartes was writing, can describe matter, and that's what Newton's laws and so on apply to, but it can't access the mind. The mind is a kind of stuff that physics doesn't have the tools to deal with. Whereas a physicalist says, no, everything there is what physics studies. Physics is our number one view of existence. So if there is something, physics will be able to come up with a theory of it. There is mind. As he starts off by saying, we have minds. Minds exist. But when he's saying that, he's not saying mind as the substance that Descartes believed in. He's saying each of us has a mind, and that's the thing we talk about when they say, my mind is busy today, or my mind is whirling and full of thoughts. He says, yeah, we have those. It's just that what they are is physical. Those things are, so, your thought that you would like pizza for lunch today, what it actually is at its basic level is some neurochemical activity up here. So your thought actually has a location, which is completely different from the Cartesian idea of mind by its very nature not having a location. So he says, well, why am I so convinced that physics has the only picture of the world? And he says, and he gives this little story of, well, physics, science is the only sphere of human activity that has achieved a consensus. It's not just in every other sphere of activity, people come up with theories, they attract followers for a while, and then they go out of fashion. Think logical positivism in philosophy. It was all the rage in the 30s, and now it is regarded as dead as a doornail, pretty much. Now there'll be a revival of logical positivism with some new wrinkles probably fairly soon, but it goes in waves. It's not as if, once you discover something, people say, okay, he or she discovered that, now that's the truth, and we build on that. That doesn't tend to happen. There's always this sort of constant undermining. So the reason why scientism is the right approach is because of the nature of science. It's the only sphere of mental activity where we've achieved consensus, where we've grown. Now, of course, Kuhn, the philosopher of science, would probably question this view of science, but even Kuhn believes in scientific progress. Someone like Paul Feyerabend, on the other hand, would definitely deny this, that there is ever consensus, that there's ever progress. But Feyerabend is considered a bit of an outlier in philosophy of science. So certainly science appears to, science seems to have progressed in that, look at all the stuff we've got nowadays. Look at all the technology we've got. When I was a lad, computers, were just starting to come out at home, and my first computer had 1K of memory. Nowadays, phones in your pocket have terabits or something. Obviously there does seem to be this sort of snowballing growth. So physics can point to its success. All right. Once we've decided that physics or modern science is the way to go to explain everything, including the mind, then we have to face some challenges. There is the problem that we'll come to in a bit that basically led Descartes to say that mind could exist separate from body, which is that I can be sure that I have a mind without being sure that I have a body, because I have this special first-person access to my mind. Whereas science can't deal with phenomena that are not public. That is, if you claim to have discovered something, but you say, nobody can check my work because only I can access it, then that is the definition of unscientific, and you people will not believe you. It has to be the case that your discoveries are public and can be checked by other scientists, by other people in the scientific community. So if the mind is supposed to be able to be studied by science, then in some sense the mind must be publicly accessible. Obviously the brain is publicly accessible. It's a physical object that, a brain surgeon can actually see and poke. But the brain and the mind are, by people like Descartes, taken to be two different things. So what is it that, what is this mind that is publicly accessible? We saw in Wittgenstein and Ryle this suggestion that the consciousness can be seen on the face, that in some sense consciousness has to be, mental states, other people's mental states has to be publicly accessible because our language of mental states is learned publicly. You cannot learn a language, you cannot learn terms that are purely private. It has to be the case that you can, in some sense, see anger so that you can be taught what anger is. And the crude way of putting this is that this is behaviorism, that a mental state is identified with behavior. anger is literally what we would normally say is indicators of anger, like, frowning and steam coming out of your ears. Those are public. Now, normally we would say, no, that's not anger, that's just what anger causes. But behaviorists say, no, that's it, that's anger. Anger is this. There's nothing beyond that is anger. Now, of course, that makes the mind a public thing that can be studied. And this is why behaviorism took off in psychology, because psychology aims to be a science, and behavior is something that can literally be studied. Now, of course, the problem that everybody immediately has with behaviorism is if you say behavior, that anger just is this kind of behavior, that seems wrong, because somebody can do this without being angry at all. They can do this just to fake it. So the idea of faking anger makes perfect sense to us, whereas a behaviorist would say that that's impossible. If anger is literally this behavior, then if you just do this, you are angry. Whereas we say, well, that's just a misunderstanding, because anger is not that. Anger has an inner aspect. And of course, the flip side of that is you could be in pain without displaying pain. So behavior is neither necessary nor sufficient for mental states. So that's the pretty fatal problem with simplistic behaviorism. Now, Ryle, in his book, The Concept of Mind, we just looked at the opening chapter in the previous talk, but in his book, The Concept of Mind, he develops this notion of, you might say, sophisticated or soft behaviorism. Instead of just identifying anger with literal states of behavior, anger just as an example, what anger is a disposition to be in certain states of behavior. So you can be angry without actually displaying it, in the same way that a glass can be brittle even though it is intact. So what is brittleness? Brittleness is a disposition that a physical object can have. A physical object can be brittle, and what that means is if you drop it, it will break. Now, something can be brittle without ever breaking. So in other words, if we use the analogy with anger, you can be angry in the sense that if you were put in a certain kind of situation, you would display certain kinds of behavior. But you can be angry without actually displaying the behavior, just because you have the disposition to display the behavior. So now, this sounds rather suspicious, because if you say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean something has a disposition? How do you identify a disposition without the display of the properties it's supposed to bring about? How do I know that a glass is brittle unless I drop it? How do I know that you're angry unless you actually show the behavior? It seems like there has to be something more. This is trying to have the behaviorism cake and eat it too. That is, you're identifying a mental state with a publicly observable phenomenon, but then you're saying, and yet it doesn't have to always be publicly observable. It seems like it's a bit empty. It's like saying, what do you mean? There's an old criticism of an Aristotelian explanation of what makes a sleeping potion effective. Why is it that this sleeping potion causes me to go to sleep? And the answer given was because of its dormitive properties. And what you realize is that this is a completely empty answer. It just means it works because when you drink it, you go to sleep. But that doesn't explain why when you drink it, you go to sleep. It's just another way of describing it. And what Armstrong says is that, well, first of all, Ryle's disposition, he explicitly says, and Armstrong quotes him, that dispositions, to possess a dispositional property is not to be in a particular state or to undergo a particular change. It is to be bound or liable to be in a particular state or to undergo. So remember, the glass is brittle without actually breaking. It's not in the state of breaking, but it is bound to be in the state of breaking when particular conditions are realized. What Armstrong says to this is this is a good quote. When I think, let's see. When I think, but my thoughts do not issue in any action. So this would be like the glass sitting there not breaking. When I think, but my thoughts do not issue any action, it seems as obvious as anything is obvious that there is something going on in me that constitutes my thought. So this is a direct rejection of Ryle's claim that to be in a disposition is not being in a state. He says, there is a state of me that is my thought. So he rejects Ryle's dispositional behaviorism. But he does think there's something right about behaviorism in that mental states are somehow logically connected with behavior. Now, there is a loose sense in which this sounds reasonable. Imagine somebody says they believe something. Like imagine somebody says, I believe that if I do anything sinful, I will go to hell. And then this person just goes around doing all the things that they claim are sinful. You know, they take drugs, they do everything, whistling happily as they do it. You would start to doubt that they actually did believe it. Why? Because their behavior gave the lie to the idea that they had a belief. So there does seem to be something to this idea that there is some kind of connection between mental states and behavior. But then, of course, you can imagine somebody being literally paralyzed and still having a very active mental state. There are people who've had, there's that book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, where they thought this guy was a vegetable, but then the only thing that could move was he could flicker one eyelid, and he managed to write an entire book by flickering his eyelid because he worked out this code with somebody who wrote the book. So he had a full and active mental life, but he couldn't display any behavior. It seems like in that sense, well, presumably what you would want to argue is that if the conditions were right in that he wasn't paralyzed, he would have behaved in a certain way. Here's Armstrong's proposal. He says, instead of saying that mental states are behaviors, or are dispositions to behavior, they are the causes of the behavior. They are, so for example, to give the analogy of brittleness, instead, what a physicist would say makes a glass brittle is its crystalline structure. So what he says gives you a mental state is whatever it is that explains your disposition. So, and that's going to be a physical state of you. So instead of saying that, as the behaviorists say, that your mental states literally are behavior, he's saying, no, mental states are that whatever it is causes you to behave that way. So that gets back the idea that my anger isn't the displays, it's whatever it is that's causing it. Now, part one is entirely compatible with a Cartesian dualism, because a Cartesian dualist would say, that's right, what causes my behavior is my mind, but of course the cause is this extra substance, mind. Then you get the mind-body problem of how this non-physical thing can cause physical stuff. So to avoid that, a materialist says, no, the causes of my behavior are not some non-physical thing, it's a physical thing. The causes are physical states of the central nervous system. So your mental states are actually physical states. This is what's called the identity theory in philosophy of mind, that mental states are physical states. Now, and he gives this nice little Hegelian analogy. This is a popular view of Hegel that I'm not sure Hegel scholars would support, that Hegel says it's the Hegelian dialectic. You start with a thesis, you swing to the opposite extreme, and then you sort of arrive at the golden mean that takes the best features of either. So the initial thesis is dualism, Cartesian dualism. There's a huge reaction to this by people like Ryle, and they say behaviorism, but that went too far, and the correct view is a synthesis that takes the best features of both, and this is Armstrong's view: the mind as an inner principle, so it's something inside me, identified in terms of outward behavior. So we name these internal causes because of what we see outwardly in people. So we call things anger because of the behavior, but what we discover later on is that what anger is whatever caused that. So a similar analogy is we call something lightning because of, we name something lightning because we see it and it is observable and has been observable to humans since forever. But then science actually analyzes lightning and discovers that it's a discharge of electricity. So we name something that we can see at a macro level, and then physics examines it and finds out what it really is. So we name mental states according to what is necessary for our interpersonal reactions, but then physics will study them and find out what they really are. So for example, this is an example often used by people who argue for this kind of view. Pain turns out to be C fibers firing. Now, what are C fibers? I don't know. Apparently, they're fibers in your brain. And they've done scans of the brain when people say that they're in pain, and that's the part of the brain that lights up, that is active when people say they're in pain. So an identity theorist would say, now we know pain, which we originally identified because of its feel to us, turns out to be C fibers firing. Or another analogy, warmth, heat, was originally thought of as, in some sense, a state of our brain, because heat is a feeling that we get. But nowadays we say, no, the feeling that we get is not what heat is. That's just something that heat causes. What heat actually is kinetic energy of molecules vibrating. The more the molecules are vibrating, the hotter it feels to us. But the feeling is not what heat is. We used to think that the feeling was what heat is, but it turns out, no, the feeling is just an effect of it. All right, so that's the view. Now, the main objection to any materialist view of the mind is, wait a minute, only I know what I'm thinking. You can look at my brain and you can't know what I'm thinking. Or even if we get to the state, as actually scientists are now doing, and they're putting chips in people's brains that apparently are enabling them to get a rough idea of what they're thinking about. But even if you can work out what I'm thinking, you cannot know what it's like to be me. You can, suppose you say, suppose you are 100% accurate with your brain scan at knowing when I'm in pain. Like you can say, he's in pain, the C fibers are firing. Pain stopped, C fibers are no longer firing. Suppose you can do that. You still can't know my pain. You can't know what it's like to feel my pain. This is the first person point of view, the consciousness. This is something that physics seems incapable of explaining because it talks in third person terms by its very nature, so that that's why we became behaviorists in the first place, so that it was publicly accessible. But it turns out my mind is not publicly accessible. Its first person consciousness is the challenge to explain. So in the final section of his article, Armstrong gives a shot at explaining what self-consciousness is. First of all, he starts out by saying, let's give an example of when it's lacking. And he says, you know, when you're on a long drive and at the end of the drive you can't remember anything, it's as if you completely zone out and then you wake up and you're there. And this happens to most people on their drives to work. Unless there's something weird happens, like there's a car accident, you don't ever remember. You just, you know, kind of zonk out and then you're there. Call this driving on autopilot, not literally, you know, Tesla autopilot or anything, but you're driving, you're doing all the driving. So clearly, this is an example of where you're actually perceiving. You are having perceptions because you don't crash. You stop at red lights. You do everything, but you just are not aware of it. So he says you can have perception without this consciousness. So that's his first example. And then he says, okay, I'm going to explain what perception is. So perception is a state, a mental state, that can occur without this thing that is the main problem for a materialist thing, as in this example. And he says, okay, let's look at what psychologists, remember this is in the 60s, he's writing this, what psychologists have been using to study perception. And they've been studying perception through selective behavior. So in other words, we are able to tell if animals can discern between two different colors by giving them a reward if they pick one color. And eventually, if they are able to always pick that color to get the reward, then clearly this is because they can see the color. So we can tell if somebody can perceive something if their behavior indicates that they can see it. They always pick the one that is that color. If they can't be successful in 100% of the cases, then it implies that they can't discern between the colors. So we can tell what they can perceive. Then he suggests, so we can explain perception as capacities for selective behavior. That's what perception is. It's a capacity to draw a distinction. If you have that capacity, that means you can perceive. If you can distinguish red, if we can tell that you pass the selective behavior test for picking out red, then you have a capacity to pick out red, and that's what it is to perceive red. Then he says, so we've got this idea of perception as possible without consciousness. Now we've got perception explained in terms of capacities of selective behavior. Now he says, I'm going to explain this thing as perception of states of one's own mind. So it's you can tell if somebody is conscious if they are capable of correctly identifying states of their own mind. So, you know, if you can say, I'm tasting coffee right now, or something like that, some internal conscious state. If you are correct at doing that, then you have the capacity for selective behavior for states of your own mind. So consciousness, he says, is perception, which we have just said that we can explain in materialist terms, directed inwards. So what's happening in the driving case is that the driver's inner eye is shut. We can explain perception through your eyes in terms of selective behavior, and now we can explain perception through your mind's eye. So consciousness, by summary, is simply the scanning of one part of our central nervous system by another. Does this really capture what consciousness is? Or does it just give us a test for whether or not someone is conscious? And also, can we really know if someone is having an inner experience to be able to work out whether or not they are successfully selecting it? So suppose someone says, I'm tasting coffee right now. Do we know that they actually are? We have to independently be able to verify that they are actually tasting coffee to know if they have the selective behavior that is successful in identifying it. So could we even get this to work out if somebody is conscious? That's the suggestion. But it's his suggestion for how a materialist theory of mind might cope with clearly the main objection. But this main objection keeps getting pressed, and we'll see one example in Thomas Nagel.